Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are connecting from. Welcome to the UCL ERICC webinar series. My name is Tejendra Ferali. I'm Professor of Education, Conflict and Peace at the Institute of Education, University College London. This is the second session of our webinar series, and this is part of the whole range of ERICC seminar series we've been running, but this particularly is hosted by UCL Institute of Education, and it aims to promote dialogue and synergy between emerging fight, the education research in conflict and protracted crisis, the ERICC program, and the work of scholars and practitioners in the field. Today's webinar is particularly focusing on teacher management in conflict and protracted crisis. As we all know, working in the field of education in conflict and crisis, teachers are the single most important actors who hold the helm of the quality education for children who are struggling in these very adverse situations. And I'm very delighted to be joined by three presenters and my friends and colleagues who have worked in this particular area for a very long period of time. And the first speaker today will be Dr. Danielle Falk, who has recently completed an extensive, rigorous review of research evidence around teachers, focusing on teacher recruitment, deployment, professional development, appraisal, compensation, benefits, and so forth. And then the second speaker is Dr. Mary Mendenhall, who will be joined by, hopefully, our third speaker, Mading Peter Angong from South Sudan, who will be particularly focusing on the study of South Sudan, drawing upon her ongoing work in the region and also particularly in South Sudan. So Danny is an education researcher at the International Rescue Committee. Her research focuses on the lived experiences of teachers in crisis contexts, as well as the policy environment influencing their work. For the last 9 years, Danny has contributed to research on teacher well-being, teacher identity, teacher professional development, teacher management, and etc. And is also a valued member of our ERICC research program based in the International Rescue Committee. Our second speaker is Dr. Mary Mendenhall, is an associate professor of international and comparative education and director of the George Clement Bond Center for African Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. As many of you who are working in this field would know that Mary's research is situated in the fields of education and emergencies, forced migration and refugee studies, and teacher policy. Her work draws on longitudinal, participatory, and qualitative approaches to critically understand and learn from and with individuals experiencing displacement. And I know that Mary has recently published a wonderful book, which I had an opportunity to read, and I'm sure Mary will be drawing on some of the reflections from her latest publication. And our third presenter is going to be Mading Peter Angong. I'm really hoping that Mading is going to be able to join. But if not, I'm sure Mary, as a co-worker, co-contributor of the work that is that Mading is involved in South Sudan, we'll be able to stand for him. So Mading is the co-founder and program manager of Education Action in Crisis, a dedicated South Sudanese non-government organization founded and managed by a team of former refugee youth who are South Sudanese educational and humanitarian professionals committed to addressing urgent community needs in South Sudan. With a decade of experience in education in emergencies, teacher development, humanitarian aid, disaster management, and research, Mading has made significant contributions to the field. So the plan is that each presenter will speak for around 10 minutes, and then I will invite Dr. Sean Higgins, who is a lecturer in education and international development at the Institute of Education, with us. His research focuses on pedagogical practices, curriculum, teacher agency, and more broadly, educational provisions in conflict and crisis settings. Sean will be making few remarks at the end and pose few questions. And we're hoping that there'll be a few minutes available for all of us to engage in further dialogue, questions and answers. So without any further ado, can I hand over to Danny, please?
Great. Hello, everyone. Can everyone see my screen okay? Great. I see some nodding heads. Perfect. Well, thank you so much to Jendra for the introduction and for convening and leading this really wonderful series with UCL and the ERICC project. And hello, good morning, good afternoon, around the world, wherever you may be. I'm really glad to be here today with my dear colleagues, Mary and Mading, to discuss teacher management in crisis-affected settings. In the first presentation, I'm going to briefly share findings from a global evidence review on teacher management that I just conducted for the ERICC project. And this is the first of several on teachers that I'm leading, with reviews on teacher professional development, teacher well-being, school leadership forthcoming. And it's also part of a larger effort of global synthesis work that ERICC is undertaking, a lot of which I'm sure will be highlighted through this series. So today I will provide some background and context for what teacher management is and who are the profiles of teachers working in crisis contexts, before sharing specific findings from the global evidence review on teacher management. Pending time, I'll begin to reflect on implications for improving teacher management, but I hope that in the discussion in the last 20 minutes or so, we can collectively pick that up as a group. And you'll see some of the images in the slides that I have are actually from about a decade of work that I've had the privilege of doing with Mading and Mary in refugee and host communities in East Africa. So teacher management refers to the policies and practices of teacher recruitment, deployment, training, compensation, and career progression. And it has really important implications for teacher quality, well-being, and retention in the profession. Even though it's central to the overall functioning and quality of education systems, it remains under-resourced and under-researched. In the evidence review, only 17 publications focus primarily on teacher management in crisis contexts. In addition to outlining what teacher management is, we need to recognize the different profiles of teachers working in crisis-affected settings. The profiles here, refugee teachers, national teachers, internally displaced teachers, returnee teachers, largely recognize teachers' nationality, displacement status, and qualifications. And they're quite honestly simple, right? We know that teacher identity is much more than this, but they remain useful in describing general teacher populations, which is really important in crisis-affected settings because teacher management policies and practices will affect different profiles of teachers in different ways. It's also important to note, and I'm sure we're going to collectively discuss this more today, that regardless of their profile, teachers in these settings contend with myriad complex challenges, a lot of which are related back to or rooted in teacher management policies, practices, and issues. These teachers are often working in overcrowded classrooms, upwards of 200 learners in some cases, with various ages, so mixed age classrooms, diverse linguistic backgrounds in their classrooms. Their learners may have acute psychosocial needs. They themselves might also be dealing with adversity. There are insufficient teaching and learning materials, inadequate school infrastructure, limited professional development that often isn't relevant to their classroom and school environments, inadequate and irregular compensation, which Mary and Mading will really pick up on in their presentation, and tenuous job security. So the evidence review that I conducted sought to understand what are the main challenges and opportunities concerning teacher management in crisis-affected settings. So the evidence specifically from contexts affected by conflict, forced displacement, et cetera, through a secondary analysis of academic and grade publications. Since we have very limited time today, 10 minutes approximately each, I'm not going to go into detail on the methodology, but happy to answer any questions when we get to the Q&A. While teacher management encompasses many things, as I previously had shared, I'm going to focus on two in today's discussion that link particularly well to Marianne Mading's research in South Sudan. So that's going to be teacher supply and teacher compensation. There are three main challenges facing teacher supply that emerge from the evidence that I'm going to highlight today that have to do with the right to work, the types of contracts that teachers receive, are further complicated by the reality that in crisis settings, there's a diverse range of education providers, including national governments, the private sector, community-based organizations, and of course, humanitarian and development actors that frequently have disparate teacher management policies, resulting in unregulated hiring practices, inconsistent professional development, inequitable teacher compensation and benefits, and ultimately result in substandard working conditions for teachers. Concerning these three challenges, we know with the right to work that evidence demonstrates the challenges displaced teachers, particularly refugee teachers, face in formally joining the national teaching workforce in the country in which they're seeking safe haven. And that restriction on the right to work is further compounded by limited cross-border equivalency mechanisms that recognize qualifications gained prior to displacement. When displaced teachers are not able to be part of a professional workforce, they are at risk of exploitative working conditions, and they lack access to systems where they can claim their rights. A related challenge concerns the pervasive nature of short-term and temporary contracts in crisis context, which exacerbate job insecurity and position teachers in roles with no pension. I'm sorry, my dog is saying hello in the background, with no pension and limited benefits. And this is the case for both refugee and national teachers who often have one-year contracts or less, where they're not sure if they'll be renewed every year. These challenges, among others, result in acute teacher shortages. These shortages are further fueled by rigid and often not responsive recruitment and deployment strategies. These settings of conflict and crisis are often categorized by recruitment and deployment policies and processes that are affected by corruption and nepotism that result in unfair recruitment and deployment that are often influenced by nepotism or ethnic favorism or political interference. And this can undermine system credibility and negatively influence learning outcomes, especially if teacher recruitment is based on relationships rather than qualifications, skills, and merit. Teacher shortages are also exacerbated by inadequate and irregular teacher compensation, which we'll hear a lot more about in the case of South Sudan after this presentation. And this drives many teachers to leave the profession or prevents them from joining in the first place. And when we say inadequate and irregular teacher compensation, we're really talking about teachers not earning a livable wage where they're able to meet their own or their family's basic needs. Contexts affected by conflict and crisis also contend with teacher management systems where teacher records and payrolls are destroyed. And again, the diverse range of entities employing teachers, right, from the national government to humanitarian development actors to the private sector, they often have inequitable compensation and benefits, especially if they're not harmonizing their teacher salaries. As previously mentioned, in many settings, refugee teachers in particular are restricted from joining the formal teaching workforce, which results in their payments being significantly less than their national counterparts. And in the evidence review, for example, we also see disparities between refugee teachers and other refugees working in different sectors, sometimes referred to as incentive workers, which show that refugee teachers are paid less than their peers hired for incentive work in health or the WASH sector. And this has really important implications, as I mentioned, for teacher quality, for teacher retention, for teacher well-being. Research shows how irregular or completely absent compensation often drives teachers to pursue supplemental income through other jobs or leave the profession entirely as they seek opportunities to earn a livable wage in order to meet their own and their family's basic needs. And for those who stay in the profession, the additional work or responsibilities or stress of not earning enough money can compromise teaching quality when teachers are tired or distracted or absent because they're contending with the other work and responsibilities that they've had. So I've just reached 10 minutes. I flew through that to try to ensure there's time for meaningful discussion where I hope we can dig into some of these select recommendations for how to improve teacher management in these settings. The one thing that I guess I want to highlight before turning it over to Mary and Mading is really around a challenge that I didn't dive so much into, which is around the exclusion of teachers themselves from policymaking and decision-making spaces. Teachers are often not given a seat at the table to contribute to the decisions that guide their work, despite being best placed to understand their own and their learners' needs. So I hope that in particular is something we can pick up on in the discussion. But I'll turn it over just in looking at the time to Mary and Mading for their presentation. And thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Danny. As of now, it doesn't look like Mading has been able to join us from South Sudan. So I'll get started and hope that he can join us. Danny's provided a lot of important details about teacher management overall. And now I'm going to narrow down on a focus of the context of South Sudan and the current state of teacher compensation and the challenges and implications that arise around this issue. So just briefly in terms of background, our team of researchers from Education Action and Crisis, which is a South Sudanese nonprofit, and Teachers College's Center for African Education, conducted this qualitative study from May to September of this year. It consisted of interviews with 16 key informants, and those key informants came from a range of donor, government, NGO, and UN representatives, and also 45 teachers of different profiles across 4 distinct geographical regions in South Sudan. This study was commissioned by Education International, which is a global federation of teachers unions. And I'll provide, similar to Danny, kind of a brief high-level overview of the study, and then we'll be happy to engage in further conversation during the discussion. So as we look specifically at the South Sudan context, unfortunately, South Sudan experiences a number of and a combination of overlapping and protracted crises, including internal armed conflict, climate emergencies, conflicts in neighboring countries, and economic shocks leading to hyperinflation. This results in a large population in need of humanitarian assistance and ongoing internal displacement and refugee hosting amidst minimal resources. In terms of the teacher landscape, we see that there are over 45,000 teachers in the public education system. However, 37% are considered volunteers, and 70% are not on the government payroll. And the vast majority hold the minimal qualifications or no qualifications at all for the grade or the school level in which they're teaching. And it's really important to state at the outset of this presentation that teachers on the government payroll have not been paid for over a year due to a number of factors, which we're going to explain in a few moments. So I'm going to quickly kind of paint the picture in terms of the teacher payment governance system in crisis settings, or in South Sudan in particular. So in addition to the public school teachers who are paid by the government, there are two other, and I might even add a third, but there are two other parallel systems for teachers working in crisis settings in South Sudan. The first is for volunteer teachers who are primarily South Sudanese, who are paid by the education cluster. And the cluster operates to support education amidst internal displacement. And the other is incentive teachers, primarily refugees, who are paid by UNHCR and other implementing partners to teach in the refugee camps and settlements. And I mentioned a third because what you're going to hear in the course of my points is that parents and communities and PTAs are very much upholding the system, and so in some ways are a fourth system that's at work here. So just quickly on this next slide, you're going to see the government, kind of the decentralized governance system for the public teachers, for the government teachers. And I'm not going to go over this, but just to quickly comment that what we see here is that the Ministry of General Education and Instruction receives just 35% of the total education budget expenditure, with more going to higher education. And then to show a little bit more about the volunteer and kind of incentive teacher payment systems, I've already covered some of these points, but we can add here that the agencies involved in the education cluster have tried to harmonize teacher payments, agreeing on a $40 in US dollars per month that's then paid out in South Sudanese pounds. For teachers working in refugee settings, there's not a set rate, and amounts vary across settings, which I'll show you a little bit more about in a moment. So in terms of our findings, we can organize them into three buckets. How much are these different profiles of teachers actually being paid? What are the challenges for paying these teachers, and what are the implications? So in this next table, you'll see a quick comparison across these three different payment systems in terms of what was kind of officially reported or documented, and what our teachers in the study were able to report. So the information for the teachers on the government payroll are consistent across those two mechanisms, officially reported and shared in interviews and the like, but they haven't been paid in over a year, and overall the monthly compensation is quite low. And while we didn't end up with any volunteer teachers paid by the cluster in our study sample, and despite the agreed $40 monthly rate, some key informants who are part of the cluster system mentioned paying less, or in some cases more. So there's still some inconsistency there. And there was much more discrepancy in amounts and compensation rates within the refugee and incentive teacher system, as noted on the slide. And overall, the takeaway here is that we see that the volunteer and incentive teachers are paid more and more consistently than teachers on the government payroll. So getting into kind of the heart of the matter, what are some of the challenges for paying teachers? Teachers of all profiles are not paid enough to keep up with the cost of living and the increasing costs caused by hyperinflation in the country. Government teachers haven't been paid at all in many, many months now, over a year. Volunteer and incentive teachers are often paid quarterly rather than monthly. And what we heard from them is that, you know, with that stretch of time in between payments, they actually are taking out loans. And then when they actually get paid, they need to pay back the loans rather than cover some of the basic costs that they would need to support themselves and their families. There are rarely, if ever, pay increases or opportunities for promotion, and there's no reliable retirement plan or benefits. The ongoing crises within South Sudan and the conflict in neighboring Sudan are causing major problems for the government due to lack of resources overall. Concerns were raised by key informants about the technical and coordination capacity within both the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Education for executing the budget and managing teacher payments, along with concerns about corruptions at various levels within the decentralized system. A lack of banking systems and mobile banking accounts make getting payments to teachers in remote areas even harder and often dangerous, leading to additional costs and logistics to support delivery of those payments. And overall, study participants express major concern about the lack of political will and commitment by the government to supporting education. And ultimately, donors are very reluctant to fund recurrent teacher salaries as they see this as the government's responsibility. And that's not unique to South Sudan. We hear that in many, many contexts, but that was something that the donors in this particular context repeated vociferously, I would say. So next, if we look at some implications, starting at the teacher level, there are kind of sweeping implications due to the lack of inadequate and consistent teacher compensation. At the teacher level, it is unsurprisingly leading to attrition, to demotivation, and especially as teachers simultaneously struggle to meet their basic needs and those of their families. In schools where different profiles of teachers might be working and some are paid and some are not, these inequities can lead to interpersonal conflict, though we also heard accounts of teachers splitting up paltry payments to share with others so that everyone benefited in some way, even though no one ultimately would have enough to cover the costs that they needed to cover. As I mentioned before, we also see parents and communities through PTAs and other mechanisms doing their level best to provide resources to the teachers to keep the schools open. But even in those cases where there's this, commitment to education and these efforts to secure additional resources, and these teachers are able to persevere, they are still having to find additional work to fill the gaps left from their low or non-existent teacher salary, which ultimately affects the abilities for them to teach well and to do their work. So here we see on the next slide a longer quote that I won't read in its entirety, but what the essence shows is that there's this kind of constant focus by the international community and the national organizations kind of working in this area to always be focusing on teacher professional development and skills building, which is of course needed and very important given what I alluded to earlier in terms of kind of the underqualifications of many of the teachers in South Sudan. But the point that was made repeatedly in our conversations is that the teacher training is not going to put food on the table. And that what this quote captures is this real frustration by those working in the setting and the teachers themselves that we're forgetting that teachers are human beings first, and that they need to eat, they need to take care of their families, they need to buy medicine, and that we need to remember that as we think about how to better assist them and to support the education system. It can't just all be about teacher professional development, which is easier in some ways to provide, right, than teacher remuneration, but something that has to, be addressed in both ways. And then lastly, as I'm also about out of time, I just want to mention a few system level implications. Again, we see the education sector in South Sudan being held up by parents and communities and external actors, but one that is very much on the brink of collapse. Schools are shuttering, teachers are making decisions to close the schools because they're not being paid, their colleagues aren't showing up, and students and teachers are not coming to school anymore in many places. More and more children who are out of school will lead to child protection risks. And this came up in pretty much every interview that we were, or conversation we were having around the study, concerns about early marriage, early pregnancy, child labor, and then a failure to return to school when and if the situation stabilizes. And while donors continue to advocate to the government to improve the situation, donor fatigue is setting in amidst distrust and mistrust of the government, with some donors considering leaving altogether. And we're out of time and unable to share the specific recommendations from the report, but there are cross-cutting recommendations for the 3 different teacher profiles and their respective teacher payment systems, and then some specific recommendations for those different profiles. And happy to kind of bring those into the conversation as we move into the discussion. So I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks very much, Danny and Mary. Now, can I invite Sean for a few comments, and then we will open for Q&A.
Thank you. Well, thanks ever so much, Danny and Mary, and it's a shame Mading can't be here, but for really enlightening and rich presentations, as well as deeply depressing ones, I think, that help plug a big knowledge gap, I think, in terms of how teachers can be better supported through management systems in challenging contexts. I think it was very useful to establish the main findings of global evidence on a range of issues, and then focus on a specific context, South Sudan. I've just got 2 questions really before opening up to the floor, and we're out of time. And I wanted to start with a broad question to both of you about the implications of your knowledge production for policymakers and the agendas of international aid organizations. It really struck me that the evidence you're presenting helps us build up a really contextualized, in-depth understanding of teacher management systems to support all aspects of teacher well-being, from their voices and perspectives to pay, compensation, and conditions. And it's a framing really that brings together what's often siloized within knowledge production, teachers' pedagogical practices and their broader human well-being. And it seems that your whole approach within a management focus seems to be worlds apart from what we often associate teacher management to be in terms of a discourse of derision of teachers within the notion of the learning crisis, where you have a very technical approach that ignores their agency and well-being, and where management is often associated with a regulatory, sort of critical rather than supportive approach to teachers who are absolutely working, as Gisandra said, on the front lines of crisis and difficulty. And I was really struck by that comment, calling for teachers to be considered as human beings first. So I know it's a big question, almost impossible to answer, but how far does your approach imply the need for a fundamental paradigm shift amongst aid and development agencies in the way teachers are framed and supported and, inverted commas, managed as actors who are navigating the front lines of crisis?
Right. Yep. So thanks very much, Sean. That's very focused and very, very thought-provoking in the sense that how teacher management could be portrayed as a kind of stealing away teachers' agency to play an agential role in their pedagogical practices, that they're there to be managed. And I think it's an interesting question. So I guess Danny and Mary, would you like to reflect briefly on this question of how donor agencies and externals actually see teachers as a domain where these people need to be managed in order to deliver education for children?
Yeah, I can go ahead first, and I can apologize for both of us because I know we'll probably be on our soapboxes um, going on about this for some time. But I really agree with Sean's reflections, especially around the need for a paradigm shift that centers and recognizes teachers for the professionals that they are in not only contributing to the education system, but really being the heart of the education system. And I would extend that argument, and though the evidence review that I worked on and presented in this presentation focused on crisis affected context, I would say this is a global issue that we see even in stable settings, that there's a pervasive deprofessionalization of teachers and the work that they do. And this is really sort of operationalized in the teacher management systems that are set up to manage them and to dictate how they sort of work in their professions. And so to flip this a little bit on its head, I think there's a lot in stable settings that we can learn from crisis affected settings. For example, there is evidence that I didn't get to fully present on in this discussion from the COVID-19 pandemic that was led by UNESCO, by Dr. Karen Mundy and a team of resources in South America and Sub-Saharan Africa, that demonstrated how even though teachers weren't included in decision-making spaces around how to respond to the COVID-19 crisis, they really took on leadership positions and were innovative and creative in ensuring continuity of learning, as well as in meeting the academic and psychosocial needs of their learners. There's also evidence on how teachers take on these what we call expanded roles in these settings. Yet, though we know that this has happened and it's been documented in the evidence, teachers are still excluded from the decision-making table. So I would say a big shift that needs to happen is to invite teachers into the spaces where decisions are being made, whether that's within a specific NGO, and I would hope eventually within strengthening teacher unions, so that teachers really have a seat at the table. And I will turn it over to Mary because I'm sure she has some thoughts on this as well.
Great. Thanks, Danny, and thanks, Sean, for the question. Yeah, it's something I think about a lot. And I think, just to echo Danny's comment, I think, we see the deprofessionalization and devaluation of the teaching profession globally, right? And so I think it's really interesting to think about how that is evolving within crisis and conflict affected settings, and what could we be doing as a community to push back against that, and change things and strengthen things, and back to Danny's point, to then kind of inform other systems and non-conflict or non-crisis affected settings. So I do think we're asking for, and the research is showing, that we need a fundamental paradigm shift. I do think it's happening slowly. I think there's a lot more effort. I've been focused on teachers for a number of years now. Years ago, it was an afterthought. It was one sentence in a report. Increasingly, you're seeing teachers being included in some of these high-level policy forums. And we need to, question a little bit the tokenism that can come with that. But I think they've been able to make a profound contribution. I think a lot more of our work is starting to center and elevate teachers and the roles of teachers. And it's demanding more attention. And that's thanks to INE's Teachers in Crisis Context group. Education International started to take on the issues of teachers in these contexts more. UNESCO's Teacher Task Force has started to prioritize teachers in these settings more. And I think it can't be ignored anymore, right? If we're going to continue to spend a lot of money and it's not going to go anywhere because we're not actually helping the teachers who are, as you mentioned, on the front lines of providing education in these settings. And I think my additional comment about this is it is a social justice issue. to continue to count on and to burden teachers across all these different profiles who are expected to shoulder the burden of the education system and for meeting humanitarian and development education goals without any real support. And I think as we continue to reflect and critique the work of the field through the decolonization agenda, I think we really have to reckon with the fact that we are relying on exploitative relationships with teachers, and not just in South Sudan, but the world over. And so that fundamentally has to change. And I think there's plenty of empirical evidence at this point about why this is so important. And so I think the advocacy has to kick in. There has to be more conversations with donors, with national governments, with teachers unions, to continue to hold those accountable, to adequately and fairly compensate teachers.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Mary and Danny. I was also thinking about when you were painting a quite horrific sort of picture of the situation within which these teachers are working. You laid out a whole range of challenges that they have been experiencing. What I would be really keen to further our conversations is around some of the promising initiatives and practices that are underway in conflict and crisis settings, that teachers are doing fantastic job despite some of these challenges and some of the barriers that they face. In your research and also in your review, Danny, did you find any promising practices or initiatives or programs that really supported teachers' well-being, but also recognized the kind of challenges that they were facing and were aimed to sort of address those challenges, and whether there was any evidence of those kind of successes? I don't want us to paint a picture that what can we do on teachers to be able to improve teaching and learning, because it could very easily be exploited as an argument around that, because a lot of these programs tend to focus on what teachers need to do to fix the educational problem, whereas there is a much bigger structural challenge within which teachers are working. Could you reflect a little bit on, within these circumstances, how do we nurture some of those hopes that might be there while we continue to challenge the problematic structural problems?
An important point to Gendra, because these things have to be happening concurrently, right? We can't just only focus on these structural problems and then not continue the work with and on behalf of teachers, definitely not on teachers, right? Part of the paradigm shift is again, inviting teachers into the discussions and recognizing them as the leaders of education without, to Mary's point, totally overburdening them as they are now. So there will be a future evidence review specifically on teacher well-being and interventions that work with teachers to enhance their professional well-being. So everyone should look forward to that. And of course, INEE has led on some great guidance notes and reviews on teacher well-being. And I can put, or maybe one of my colleagues at INEE can put a link in the chat to some of the recent work that TIC has been leading, or the Teachers in Crisis Context Working Group. Excuse my use of the acronym in the chat box. I think, though, in terms of promising practices that we see specifically having to do with teacher management, and this also gets, I think, to another question that I saw in the Q&A about promising policies and practices in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, we do see policy shifts that are becoming more inclusive, especially of displaced teachers, which is, I think, an important signaling that teachers are increasingly being, or there's work to increasingly center them in education discussions. So, for example, the Djibouti Declaration in IGAD in East Africa that advocates for the cross-border equivalency mechanisms to recognize teaching qualifications gained outside displaced teachers, where displaced teachers are currently working, if they gained teaching credentials in their countries of origin. There's pushes for the inclusion of displaced teachers and refugee teachers in particular into national systems. Amongst many other important calls to center and support teachers working in these settings. We also see countries, especially in East Africa, like in Kenya, for example, and Uganda with the education response plans 1 and 2 that do talk about teachers and teacher well-being, or the Sharika plan in Kenya that, these are plans that operationalize the comprehensive refugee response framework from UNHCR about the inclusion of refugees into national systems. They're increasingly recognizing teachers in that and what that means for refugee teachers. At the same time, and I don't want to diminish the importance of signaling that in policies often have immense challenges in translating into practice. And so there's not that much evidence out there around how do we overcome that? Like what are promising examples of overcoming that gap between policy and practice so we can achieve some of these exciting developments? And yeah, again, I was just focusing on East Africa, also given the question in the chat, to realize these policies. And I will stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. Mary, would you like to reflect on those?
I mean, just quickly, I don't think I can name, specific projects or initiatives. I think we still have a lot of improvement to make across the board in general. I think, again, it's the conversation about teacher well-being has continued to evolve. But I would just impress upon all of us to remember that teacher well-being is also about paying teachers. That is really the heart of it. We have to be able to compensate teachers for their work, for their time, for their efforts, so they can feed their families and take care of themselves and be able to show up and become, if they're not already, professionals, depending on their entry point into the profession. And we can talk about continuous professional development. We can talk about coaching. We can talk about mentoring. We can talk about inclusion of teachers and policymaking practices. If we haven't paid the teachers, it doesn't really matter. And I'm being a little bit, flippant or blunt or whatever about that. But I think we have to shore up the focus of the conversation, which is around providing adequate compensation, consistent, regular, livable wages, so that these individuals can do their work. And if we don't do that, and if we don't take it seriously, and if we don't find ways as a community to shore up those resources, we're going to continue kind of spinning our wheels around the provision of quality education in many contexts.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much. So there's a few questions in the chat. So one of them that I was able to pick up was around the question relating to the support for mental health and well-being of the teachers working in armed conflict situations. And then a related question to that is also, can the local cultural and social context be considered in designing the interventions? That's from Muhammad Ilyas. And also there are a couple of other questions which related to the answers that you gave around promising practices and positive examples from Freya. And there was another colleague who was asking a similar kind of question. But also there is one more question for Danny. Would you have time to identify the research areas in this field? So I think you highlighted some of the problems, but what area of research that we need to try and focus on as we move forward? Maybe Danny, would you like to comment on that? And there's another question from Genevieve. To what extent are external education actors like INGOs or clusters part of the problem in creating unjust, unfair, and unregulated payment structures and exploitative relationships that Mary mentioned? So could you reflect on that? So can we briefly respond to these questions, and then we'll see how we go with time.
Can I respond to Genevieve's question, and then Danny, you can pick it up? Yeah, I mean, great question, Genevieve. And I think there is some complicity in that, and in some places, right? I've definitely heard, not just in the South Sudan study, but in work I've done in Chad and Uganda and other countries outside of Africa, where teachers who have, tried to mobilize or kind of agitate for improvements to their support structures, whether it's compensation or other benefits, they can quickly find themselves out of a job by the UN and the NGOs that have hired them. And so that's really problematic. And there needs to be a way for them to kind of safely mobilize and advocate. And certainly we do see protests and other things come together where there's collective action that then really demands the UN and NGOs and others in those spaces to pay attention and to respond. But we do see, I think some real kind of tendencies to kind of squash that dissent and to, prevent those spaces from taking shape. And that's problematic. So I think, and then related to that, I guess, is where there are teachers' unions, they tend not to include the diversity of teacher profiles that are present in these different contexts. So there tends not to be a platform or a space for coalition building. And I think that will also start to slowly change as there's a bigger tent created for those different profiles of teachers. And it's all, ultimately all about the recognizing, the teachers for the hard work that they're doing, continuing to professionalize the field, and obviously bolstering the quality of education. And I think the different issues, while they might be different across some teacher profiles, ultimately inform each other and strengthen potentially the policies and the practices around that. So I think it'd be interesting to continue to see, a stronger role for the unions or collective units in refugee camps or settlements or others, but there needs to be some protection for them to be able to carry out that work. And that's something that I think, the different international actors have to learn to interact with and engage with, and build relationships with unions, which I don't think happens all that often in crisis context. So I think, there's some real challenges that are happening that the UN and NGO actors need to be kind of held responsible for and think about a different way of engaging in those conversations. And then thinking about an increased or expanding role of teachers' unions in some of these contexts.
Great. Danny?
Yeah, so two quick responses to Dr. Muhammad's question about contextualizing interventions, especially around teacher well-being, or just really recognizing the important social, cultural, political, economic contexts where teachers work. I fully agree it cannot be done without that. And I would just point again, to Gendra had mentioned this, but to Mary's book that she co-edited with colleagues on the building resilience in Crises Through Education EU-funded project, the BRICE project. And feel free to either email Mary or myself. I was able to work on that project to share some conceptualizations of how to think about well-being. And I think the chapter that Mary worked on, as well as Dr. Gauthier Marché, because we didn't even really focus on this, but teachers in these settings, we also have to think about their physical well-being. Many of them are working amidst armed conflict or violence, and they are targeted, in fact, because of their role as educators and what that means for their well-being and how interventions can sufficiently address that. And in terms of research and what fields of research we need to be considering. I mean, I think there's 17 articles in crisis effect and publications with rigorous research in conflict and crisis affected settings on teacher management. And it certainly has grown, especially with the work of UNESCO IIEP on teacher management in refugee settings. Also UNHCR with Mary again has done a lot of recent research on teachers in context of forced displacement. So it's growing, but we just need more research across multiple areas, particularly in teacher management. And I would encourage that whatever the focus is on, whether it's compensation, whether it's teacher contracts, whether it's recruitment and deployment, whether it's professional development and appraisal, or career progression, or data and EMIS systems, we need to include teachers in what we're prioritizing in research, and when possible, without burdening them, of course, include them in the research itself. So I will end there because I see the time.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, Danny and Mary. I think, Mary, you stressed on how important it is to prioritize teacher compensation, right? I think we've discussed this issue in different fora in the past, and again, it comes quite clearly and quite powerfully from your research. But we also know that establishing a stable teacher compensation structure in conflict and crisis settings is very challenging, because donors don't want to commit to it, because, as you said, they see national governments being responsible, but the national governments have their own challenges dealing with conflict, corruption, and all kinds of issues. Sometimes I find it a bit frustrating to see that, how do we actually move forward with this? How do we address that? How can research contribute to find a way forward so that we are not limiting ourselves in identifying and describing the challenges, but also contributing to this advocacy policy forward, or doing something so that we can actually change this very stagnated difficulty that teachers have to work within. But having said that, I think teachers are engaged in a whole range of locally driven, innovative pedagogical practices. They're constantly trying to improve their teaching and learning, and the pedagogical challenges that Sean was talking about earlier. They're trying to address them despite these difficulties. Many teachers decide to stay in the profession despite these difficulties, right? And I think there is a role for continuous teacher professional development, supporting and harnessing their initiatives, where I think external actors, academics, and other professionals can collaborate with teachers to build synergies and to support, while the bigger problems are out there for us to carry on challenging. So we are just over time now. I think it's been really interesting conversation. And please do feel free to get in touch with our presenters if you would like to access their publications and find out more about their research. And I would like to thank all participants who joined this webinar today. and would like to also thank our presenters for their contributions. Danny, Mary, and Sean, thanks very much. And we end their webinar now. Thank you.